Well, my name is Tim Ehlen. I came across the books you see I'm selling over here from IHS Press. And in 2005 at a conference in South Bend, Indiana, had nothing to do with Notre Dame. Completely independent conference, and those books just kind of called to me. So I've been involved with John Sharp, IHS Press. I did a 10-part lecture series at Catholic University when I used to live in Northeast DC. It was called Building Catholic Communities. It was a graduate level course. The Southern Poverty Law Center, if you know who they are, chased us off campus. They did, but we continued. We didn't miss a beat. And then I'm on their list, yes, right next to John. It's a badge of honor. And then in 2009, I did a 4-day study group with some of the top Catholic scholars in the country at a Dominican monastery a Benedictine Abbey in DC, St. Anselm's. It was wonderful. And we realized that, while we all were attuned to this and excited about it, it was too early. This is 2009, mind you, okay? So Michael has put this thing on the map here, and that's why. So I think we all owe gratitude to IHS Press and John and his many excellent books. He's got hundreds of titles more he wants to get into print, time willing. And but it's exciting to see this interest, and especially since we have a younger audience too. Right. On the back of your handouts, I'd like to start with this quote from a book called After Virtue, and I'm going to use the Braille version, but you can read that along with me. And the reason I like this is because it describes perfectly where we are today. Okay, so. It's always dangerous to draw too precise parallels between one historical period and another, and among the most misleading of such parallels are those which have been drawn between our own age and the epoch in which the Roman Empire declined into the Dark Ages. Nonetheless, certain parallels there are. A crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of goodwill, that would be you, turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium, the government, and ceased to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that imperium. Cognitive dissonance. How do you support the Democratic Party and try to be moral and civil? You can't. They don't work. And Joe Biden, of course, is a Catholic. What they set themselves to achieve instead, often not recognizing fully what they were doing, was the construction of new forms of community. I want to emphasize that, new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarianism and darkness. If my account of our moral condition is correct, we too for some time have now reached the turning point. Thank you. Is correct. We too, for some time now, reached that turning point. This book was published in '81, by the way. What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community. Emphasis on that, local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages, which are already upon us. And if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we are not entirely without grounds for hope. Hope is a theological virtue. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontier. They have already been governing us for some time. And it is our lack of consciousness, I don't think that's the case anymore, and it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We are not waiting for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict. Yes, I do. So this is where we are today. And this book was published or written by a professor, I think he's still alive, at Notre Dame, Alistair McIntyre. I heard him speak once at Dominican House of Studies in D.C., brilliant man. But he's like any good teacher, he's able to take complex issues and make them simple and understandable. Father John Hardin, the famous Jesuit from Detroit, whom I also knew, was also had the same ability. So I think that sums up where we are. And the book was published, I mentioned, in 1981. 100,000 copies in print, different languages. I think he's still alive, and he's like professor emeritus. He's in charge of research and everything as well at Notre Dame. So one of the few good guys there. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Catholic land movement. And I'm going to talk for a bit and then open the floor to questions, okay, because I think you probably have better things to say than I might. And this handout, by the way, highlights some of the books that are over there that are kind of fundamental to the movement understanding the basics. And of course, there's a 2-page summary of the movement for you to keep as well. I think this is exciting. And it's as John Sharp says, I've been waiting for you. He picked up on this a long, long time ago. So the Catholic Land movement, we're actually going back a bit here. We really stand on the shoulders of some great and holy men and some great and holy popes. Where did I put my notes here? It goes back to Chesterton and Belloc, of course, with their books. There was an encyclical published in 1891 called Rerum Novarum, and that is considered the first of the great Catholic social encyclicals, and it heavily influenced the early works of Chesterton and Belloc. In fact, Belloc's first book called The Servile State, which we don't have over here, another publisher carries that, we should have it, but it's part of his trilogy on the subject of distributism, which is moral economics, which predates capitalism and socialism by 600 years, probably 1,000 years. And the distributist movement didn't have a name, is largely responsible for creating the large and collectively wealthy middle class of Europe. And the epitome of this wealth created by this new middle class, and we're no longer slaves, they were free men, and they owned their own means of production, is the great cathedrals of Europe. So they had the love of God, they had the skills, they had the money. And so I mean, in my book, I'm sure there's some scholarship on it, but that's in my estimate of things, that, you know, that's the reflection of this new wealthy class. And instead of all for themselves, they tithed probably more than 10% to the church. So Belloc, McNab, of course, Father Vincent McNab, Belloc, and then Leo XIII, 1891, Rerum Novarum, and then the follow-up 40 years later, Quadragesimo Anno, 1931 as well, kind of gave them a new boost to it. And in the early document, it was really about the excesses of the industrial age. I think today we're worried about the excesses of everything. It's not limited. It's not limited. So I think the Catholic Land movement is a very appropriate response to watching our world spin off, or try to spin off its axis. So the movement was founded, the first what they call Catholic Land Associations. I'm going to back up a bit. So 1926 to 1936, when Chesterton died, they formed something called the Distributor League. And what they did, they were teaching fellow Brits what they used to have in terms of a moral economic model. And so they did that through writings, through lectures, through debates, publications, and basically because England was the first to defect, if you will, with Henry VIII's defection. And then England had the first central bank chartered in 1694. First central bank, 1694, right? And the first thing that the usurers did, I'll just use that nomenclature, is to loan the crown 1.2 million pounds. That's when a pound was a pound. It's a lot. So they had their claws into the government. And they always knew that it was more profitable loan to government than it was to like businessmen and farmers and et cetera. So they wanted, and they did. And then later, of course, the central bank spread throughout Europe and all the major cities, Catholic cities too, by the way. So in 1929, the first Catholic Land Association was formed. This was like in the midst of the Distributor League's work. And it was formed by clergy and laymen. This was in Glasgow, Scotland. And the idea was to reestablish an agrarian social economy that could counter the prevailing industrial regime. It was their response, and this came spontaneously out of their work. Obviously, this is part of a broader social and intellectual movement known as distributism, which advocates the widespread distribution of land and wealth amongst the general population. So, if you will, there's 4 basic economic models in the history of the world. There's slavery, there's capitalism, there's socialism, and there's distributism. 3 of them share a common trait, and that is a centralized economic model. Okay, and basically, and I figured this a long time ago, is that capitalism and socialism are the same side of the coin because they're centralized economic models. And one of the books over there you might be interested in, called Capitalism or Catholicism, Protestantism, and Capitalism. It was a PhD dissertation by an Italian named Fanfani. The whole book is like sound bites, but one of the things I recall from the book is that capitalism leads to socialism. And we see that happening in our country today. It's just a natural evolution. And because they want more than just economic control. They want complete control, and that's where they're going. They're going to try, but it's not good. So, so really, in a sense, this movement is an economic movement. You know, craft beer is distributist alcohol. Homeschooling is distributist education. That's right. Local beers, right? Local flavors, local ingredients. You know, local bartender. Homeschooling is distributist education. Homesteading is distributist farming. There's any different model. It's never gone away. In fact, I've always felt that the distributist model is rather intuitive. You know, small is beautiful. You know that you've heard of the book Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered. That book, interesting story with that, written by a fellow named E.F. Schumacher, Fritz Schumacher, German economist. He was born in post-World War I Germany, moved to England and saw World War II on the English side of the channel. Was always looking for the truth, and he had written papers and gave lectures. He was a brilliant man. And then finally said, "You've got to read the church. You've got to read the church fathers." Says, "What do they know?" You know. So he finally started to read the church fathers, and especially Reverend Navarro. And he said, "Oh my gosh, they figured this out a long time ago." So it caused him to become a Catholic. And his first book, he wrote two books actually. Economics, Small is Beautiful, Studying Economics as If People Mattered. One of the things he regrets about that book, it was translated into 17 languages. It's still a bestseller. But one of the chapters called Buddhist Economics. He regrets that because he said it should have been Catholic economics. He was hired by some Buddhist country, I forgot which one, I think in Jakarta, to help them with their economic situation. And you know, so he learned a lot about Buddhism. He wasn't a Buddhist, but he was impressed. You know, he was very simple, honest people. But heretics.
Well, it's really the subsidiarity.
Thank you. Yeah, that's at the epicenter of it, really, subsidiarity. You want to explain subsidiarity?
It's just like everything from the local level, from the family to the neighbor to the town to the city to the kind of goes from
Bottom up instead of top down, right?
We don't. Now
No, everything's top down, right?
And I'm like as guilty as anyone. It's like, oh, Amazon, you know, because it's convenient.
Well, I'm a local bookseller.
Because it's so easy.
Well, it's so good.
That on purpose.
Oh, they do, yeah.
You get hooked.
I forgot the numbers for Amazon, but I mean, there's huge volumes of sales. Everything.
Yeah.
You can get toilet paper if you want, you know. So come on and have a seat.
Yeah.
So I'm a little off track here, but thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, subsidiarity is at the epicenter of the movement. So going back to the movement itself, anyways, going back to Small is Beautiful. It's a corner. We should carry that book as well, but it's a cornerstone book to understanding. It's a good primer for this model. But he did become a Catholic. But another book he wrote was called Guide for the Perplexed. And it could be actually a college level course on philosophy. It was because he was in a philosophical search for the truth, and so he said that was more important of his two books. So he had his daughter Barbara promised to publish this book. He died in '74, and she published it the same year he died. So both those books are worth reading. But there's an example of somebody looking for the truth his whole life, if you will. And then when he finally paid attention to his friend, Mr. Collins, to read the Pope, read the Church, he did. And he went, oh my gosh, where have I been? Truth is truth. So let's see. This decentralized, going back to the movement, this decentralized economy would better integrate economics with family and community life, as I mentioned earlier, local forms of community, create a more just and humane social order, and the watch for this movement is and must remain decentralization, okay? I mean, we live in a hierarchical church, but we're also decentralized, General Motors some years ago, I'm from Detroit, by the way, and I used to work for Chevrolet and Chrysler, actually studied how the church hierarchy is structured because they thought maybe they could remodel the GM hierarchical structure, which is extensive and expensive to how the church does it. I don't know if they ever did with it, but they did study that idea. So after the formation of the first land association in Glasgow, 5 additional associations were formed. One in London, one in Birmingham, one in Manchester, one in Liverpool, and then Nottingham as well. Different. So from 1929 till 1933, six associations were formed. And the purpose of these associations was to teach young men how to become farmers or farm managers. And as Chesterton so pithily said, he says, replant the faith by replanting the faithful. Okay. And this, as I mentioned, this is more than just farming. At the heart of it, it's an economic model, and you know, this is the rebuilding society from the bottom up. It's the only way you can do it. There's no law that we can pass. There's no administration that'll take authority. There's too much push against it. A lot of people don't get it. Just, you know, build it by example. You know, you'll have an influence of a radius of what you're doing, where you're doing it, and how you're doing it as well. And by the way, you know, the small-scale agricultural movement, as I like to call it, I've been involved with a group in the DC area called CASA, the Chesapeake Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture, a lot of syllables, largely driven by progressives, which is interesting, but it's growing like crazy. It's really encouraging, actually. So we need to have our own CASA, the Catholic Association for Sustainable Agriculture, right?
So that's your area.
That's my area. That's right. Yes, right. Yeah, very woke. Whew. When Francis said, who am I to judge? One of the farmers that was volunteering on, the young woman, had a pumpkin and drew, very nicely done, of Francis's portrait. Because she was not of our tribe. So the Catholic land movement was the most concrete and ambitious implementation of distributist principles. And like I said, Chesterton said the Catholic land movement is distributism in action. It starts from, everything starts from agriculture. You know, Aristotle said agriculture is the first art. At least it's attributed to him. Let's see. It sought to demonstrate that this economic model is a viable alternative to capitalism and socialism. Obviously, it's a healthy religious culture cannot flourish under these other economic models. Industrialization breaks the bonds of humans with family, community, and nature, effectively dissolving the primordial bonds that makes religion tangible. This comes from probably Fleet of the Fields. Okay. Fleet of the Fields. I think it's in your handout as well. Again, I gave you bullet points. The Catholic land movement was not attempting to create a utopia, nor was a Luddite rejection of technology. Luddites, of course, you know, do everything by hand. You know, and a chainsaw might be better than a handsaw, right? It's a prudent approach to economic life based on small-scale agriculture, craft making, and retailing. Again, you know, subsidiarity, small scale. Let's see what else. The Catholic land movement was explicitly based on the cornerstone of Catholic social teaching, social subsidiarity, which holds that an individual should rely on the most basic levels of social and technical complexity to achieve its goals, by relying on the household, family, community, and nature's bounty to regain a modicum of human dignity and freedom. And the overarching goal of the Catholic land movement went beyond the establishment of a just and equitable economy. It was an attempt to preserve the condition under which a vibrant Catholic culture could thrive. My dad had a small manufacturing plant in Warren, Michigan, just on the border with Detroit. Made gas brake lines and gas line for basically Chevy and Ford. I worked with them for about 4 years. And it always saddened me, and I now know why, but you had workers. It was a clean environment, what they call light industry. It was noisy, but not dangerous. Every now and then somebody got their hand caught in a machine. That would hurt. But it always saddened me is that, and these were largely high school kids, you know, that this is the life they had to look, you know, doing a rote, simple, stupid job, boring job, you know, robbing of the soul when, you know, they could be out milking a cow or chasing the chickens or, you know, feeding the hogs or, you know, planting a garden, you know. I mean, I understand this now, but I understand now, you know, my sensibilities, you know, were kind of in tune to, it was a boring job. Now, I was the SOB, son of the boss, so it was different for me, but still, it was boring for me too, like, yikes. Let's see. It is at the family level that the active ingredients of religious faith, with trust, obedience, discipline, and fidelity, are cultivated. A book I have over there called Restoring the Family is a book you should get. It's a summary of another book that will be translated from French. It was published by a French Monsignor in 1910 about the practices in pre-French Revolutionary France in terms of preserving the wealth and the patrimony of the family for future generations. The French Revolution destroyed that. Our tax codes destroy that. And interesting. So there's and if you ask for it, I have a handout from that talk as well, which I'm not giving today. I'm giving it now. But that'll help you as well. So we have to start someplace again, start to preserve family wealth for future generations. So that's property, wealth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some other books you can follow up with how to implement this as well. I have that in the handout as well. That's very interesting. What else? However, the movement was not without issues that were aligned against it taking permanent room. Remember, this is pre-World War II. And by the way, in my own opinion too, I think when the soldiers came back from World War I and told the atrocities of that war, 20 million horses died in Europe during World War I. Can you imagine the stench that would have caused? 20 million horses, because that was the main mode of moving goods and services and troops around, was by horse. That's not to include all the soldiers and civilians that died as well. But I think when those soldiers came home from that war, I think the world took a collective gasp. The world never seen mechanized warfare like this before. And so the response came over time, and I think Belloc and Chesterton were at the forefront of this, with Catholic thought on it and leading that movement. But around the world, here in the United States, there was a Back to the Land movement in 1930 called I'll Take My Stand. Was a dozen Southern writers talking about, going back to the land, and later they wrote a subsequent book to it. Belloc was invited to write a chapter in that book. New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, of course, there was a Back to the Land movement that says we need a simpler, more equitable, sane way to live. So it was not just our response. I think it was universal, but it says there were issues that were aligned against it taking permanent root. There were financial problems. The Catholic Land Movement in England asked for one collection per year from the church to support the effort. That did not happen for whatever reason. The movement was maligned and misunderstood, called reactionary. Yeah, it was. It never gained a foothold among fellow Catholics who considered it quaint and even romantic. Well, it does say it in a way it does. Finally, its most eloquent and forceful spokesman died a few years after its inception. So Chesterton, I mentioned, died in 1936. So that was the end of the Distributors League. Father Vincent McNab, his book over there his two books in particular called Christ or Social Chaos, excellent book. And he talks about that in that book too. There's a chapter where he says specifically, we should do this as community, do it in community. That's what you're doing, friend. He died in 1943. Maurice Barry died in 1945. Belloc died in 1953, but he had a stroke in 1941. For the next 12 years in his life, he was basically out of it. So that hurt. And it says, regardless, the most important tangible reason for the demise of the Catholic movement and distributism was World War II. Now you had government and industry married at the hip to produce weapons, unprecedented. And so the material and human demands for the war unified state and business corporation produce war materials. And this new union reordered the entire global economy. As I mentioned, I'm from Detroit. And Ford Motor Company built a 17-acre plant from scratch. It really is an amazing story. To build the B-24 Marauder, 4-engine, medium-duty bomber. Everything came out of the plant. 80,000 parts went into that, including rivets. Everything was made in-house. Of course, they made their own engines. But at the peak of production, they were rolling off a complete airplane ready for test flight every 55 minutes, from start to scratch. And America won the war largely because we had more tanks, more Jeeps, more half-tracks, more Deuces, more aircraft. I think something like 3 out of every aircraft that America built at the time came out of that factory alone. Yeah, it's amazing. It really is amazing, but, anyways. And as Eisenhower warned us in 1961, the military industrial, and it used to be the full title of it in its original speech, draft of the speech, the military industrial congressional complex. You had to take that out. Anyways, so let me wrap this part up. I have some other notes, but I'll wrap up here and then let's open the floor to discussion, okay? We've got some time left. It is no irony that the leaders of the Catholic land movement saw the coming crisis of an industrial society. It's steeped in the wisdom of the Catholic faith. They could see past the empty promises of industrialism. In hindsight, the real reason the Catholic land movement failed to take root was that it was premature. It might have been, I don't know. The distributists knew that the only way to redeem the economy and its religious foundation was to move towards a decentralized economy in which agriculture placed a central role. If indeed the efforts to establish a wide distribution of wealth and land through the Catholic land movement was prepared, I think today our day has come. I'll leave it at that. There's more. But why don't we open the floor to questions or discussions? I didn't do that good of a job.
Sorry, can you explain, you said that both socialism and capitalism are centralized model. How is capitalism centralized?
Well, it's decentralized in a sense. It's with, well, of course, at the hub of it is our own Federal Reserve Bank, chartered in 1913 and 1914, where World War I comes along. Now they had, the economic powerhouse of the United States and the manufacturing powerhouse of the United States. They could now do this war. So it's centralized in the sense through the banks and the industrialists, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, with all the workers. My dad's little plant was part of that structure as well. So it is centralized without a doubt. And of course, socialism absolutely is. It's in the formula. And as I mentioned before, one of the books over there, Catholicism, Protestantism, and capitalism is among the many things that Fanfani says. One is that capitalism leads to socialism, and we see that today. Very interesting. So the economic model known as distributism, moral economic model, decentralizes it. It's designed to place as much wealth as wide as possible. You need laws, of course, that promote that, which we don't have. Belloc's book, The Restoration of Property, talks about some of those solutions. And when I first started wrapping my head around all this, it took a while, and then I finally got it. But when you see the consequences, and when I moved to Northern Virginia in 1980, I could see the disparity between the haves and the have-nots, and that gap has gotten wider. There's a deliberate attack on the middle class. There just is, because they want it either to be haves or have-nots, right? One or two classes. So yeah, so it takes a while. And the capitalists and the socialists actually took portions of the distributist model and made it part of their own. So sometimes people have said, oh, that's socialism. No, it's not. It's distributism. They just borrowed that portion, for their efforts as well. So it takes a while. I'm a distributist now. I like local beer.
We're kind of new to this game.
Sure.
We're playing catch up. COVID was an eye-opener.
Mm-hmm.
It was for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
When did it reemerge and kind of stop it where it kind of went dormant after World War II?
Well,
It's been going on forever, and I was just involved in
that's a good
the
question.
real world.
That's a good, no, that's a good question. I think it did lie dormant. I don't know if there was any activity. There was probably interest amongst largely scholars, I would think. And, some of us in the field who understood it as well. I just came across it in 2005, and it grabbed me right away. And I started reading a great deal. First I read about the movement, and then I read about distributism. I go, oh my gosh, this is great. So it's been around. It's just been, but I think the time is right now, obviously. They've overplayed their hand. They've scared some people and alert others. And, like it says in the quote after virtue, men and women of goodwill, which means of God's will. Began without realizing it. It's kind of interesting. I think we're alert to what we're up to now. And I think the Catholic land movement is a proper response to the world's insanity. So, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the interesting thing is, like, if you follow different people online, you have even secular people.
Of course.
Like, they're going out and buying land. Like, I'll follow Peak Prosperity, and I don't think he was in business.
What's his name?
Chris
Martin.
Martin.
Yeah, I know. He's a little too secular for me.
He is.
Yeah.
But they're all. He definitely is. But they're all like seeing different things, and then maybe you don't know how God is.
Correct.
They know there's a problem. There's solutions.
Correct. Correct.
But
correct.
they do have like grassroots as far as local about
Because
distributing
I said in the
animals.
car up, we're just preppers with faith.
We're not even really preppers.
Well, we're
We're
attempting to be.
Well, I think farmers are the ultimate preppers
Correct.
because you get to grow your own food, raise your own animals, process everything yourself. It's self-sufficient. As I like to say, you know, the three components of the movement are self-sufficiency. How did I put this? Self-sufficiency, community, or self-sufficiency, subsidiary. Well, that's the same thing. Subsidiary and community. You know.
Self-sufficiency, subsidiarity.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I made a little poster on that. Self-sufficiency, community, and the faith, the Catholic faith.
Yeah.
That's it. You know, it couldn't be easier. Yeah. As I like to say too, we have our Lord, Our Lady, His Church, and we have each other.
And you see why they're attacking the farms, the governments, because agriculture's sort of that
Sure.
centerpiece of
Yep,
your,
it is. And farmers tend to be resilient, independent thinkers, self-sufficient, stubborn. Sometimes it's hard for farmers, you know, change their minds about, okay, don't do this and try this, and why? You know, my dad didn't do that, so they're a little stubborn in that respect. But yeah. Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about the story of Father Vincent McNab? I've seen his books, but I don't know who he
Sure.
is. So
Okay. Well, he's a Dominican, you know, OP. I have his. He died early on, you know, after the movement. Very influential. He's considered like the chaplain for the Catholic land movement. He was very close friends with. Father McNab died in 1943, early on. He was very powerful. Good writer, good speaker,
he was
tough.
English, I'm assuming.
Yes, oh, absolutely, yes, absolutely. He was tough, excellent writer, you know, believed in the movement, and very influential in a priestly way. You know, it was not about him; it was about Christ and the Church, and so he was considered the unofficial chaplain for the movement. And thank God we have him still today with his books and his work. Yeah. Last year there were a number of Dominicans here, and I couldn't sit in, but there was a talk about Father McNab. You know, so he's out there with a coyness, as far as, you know, whom they're proud of and should be. Yeah. Yeah. So I've got 2 books of his over there.
So, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I
You're up.
just curious. I mean, I'm sorry. Me too. I'm new at this, and just, you know, but I'm just thinking about. So we've got this distributist model, and I don't fully understand distributors.
That's
yet,
okay.
but
It takes a while.
Thinking about like local.
Right.
It seems like, in a way, but the church itself is kind of more like, you know, the cathedrals are all in these big cities.
Right.
Where we are, you know, trying not to be. So is there a model for how does the church get integrated if we're going out to the country and the churches are like where I just moved, there's like at least half an hour to the closest church, and that's not even so I don't know if you could talk about that. Is there ideas of how, like, you know, decentralized, you can't have a decentralized church, but you know what I'm saying, like.
Correct. I think this has to be, you know, one of the books is called The Rural Solution. I think we need to be rural. I think the fit's going to hit the shan soon, as they say, and we need to be clear of the cities. I think they're going to erupt in chaos and violence, my personal opinion, and it might be orchestrated on purpose, you know, for different reasons, but it'll be safer in the countryside and then in the community as well. Maybe a number of homesteads, you know, close proximity. Some years ago, a friend of mine here in Pennsylvania, I need to reconnect with Mike, but several families bought homesteads. They weren't close to each other, but the idea was some sort of community. I'd see how that's doing. But personally, I'd like to see Catholic agrarian communities form. And I think one way to do that is to start incubator farms. You know, so get a couple hundred acres and then chop it up into smaller parcels and have all the infrastructure in place. So like implements, tractors, tools, water, maybe deer fence and portions of it. So to provide all the infrastructure to get started, and then have some training there as well. Work with each other, help each other, and then you've got you've got a huge farm with different specialties and community. I think that's the way to go. There's something called NIFTI, N-I-F-T-I, that stands for the National Incubator Farm Training Institute. So there's an incubator for incubator farms. I have to find out. I put together a 250-page 3-ring binder full of information on incubator farms, and I've started a study group. It's kind of fizzled. I think I need to revive that as well. But I think we need a model. I think we need one of those to kind of proof of concept and teach others how to do the same thing as well. Again, the progressives have done a really good job with these incubator farms. Yeah, they're all over the country.
Does anybody, to you and to others, to your point about access to churches,
Oh yeah.
does anybody see the church taking a role anywhere? Any bishops taking a role in trying to address, that exact issue? We have a little bit of a gift in our particular situation, but I don't see any church effort. Am I wrong? Is there a church effort anywhere?
I know Mike is trying to get some support from the local bishop, and there's a priest down in North Carolina. I think he's here actually. Father, how about yourself? What would you have to say to that question?
I don't want to raise my hand because I came in late.
That's okay. You're probably well ahead of us on this.
I can share something. You don't have to turn around. My name is Father Jules. I'm a Brooklyn priest, a diocesan priest.
Oh wow.
And I'm entering into the order called the Transalpine Redemptorists.
Oh yes, right.
You can think of us as traditional Redemptorists. St. Alonsus, his ideal for the priests, very, very brief story, is that he was in Naples, in the Kingdom of Naples in Italy in the 18th century, and he recognized in city centers lots of churches, out in the country not so many. And the priests, most diocesan priests, lived at home, and it was comfortable. You got mama's cooking, you saw your nieces and nephews, said mass in the morning, and then you lived a bachelor's life. Of course, you should be living sanctity, but
Right.
a man could enter the priesthood and be comfortable and have his stipend and say mass. And he wanted the Redemptorists to go out into the countryside where there were fewer priests, and sometimes there'd be, most of the times it would be Tio Prete, the uncle priest. So in the mountains, here's the family priest serving this small village of 300, but no one wants to go to confession to him because he married my parents, he knows my neighbors, so I'm not going to admit X, Y, Z.
Right.
So the Redemptorists would live a contemplative life at a monastery, and then go out and preach popular missions, not planting churches, but reviving the faith in these different places, and also hearing the confessions in these places for the sake of those who weren't going or were confessing badly, lying or hiding things because of their discomfort with the priest who was in that village. The reason I bring this up is one of the things that struck me in joining this order, and I've always had a contemplative bend, is that I was visiting a certain country in Latin America, and I was in not a very huge city, but you'd call it a city. And if I threw a rock, I would hit a church. I was like, why did the Dominicans build their church right next to the Franciscans, right next to the Jesuits? Because it was a center of activity, it was a center of commerce, and if we build a church in the mountains, who's going to donate to us? Who's going to feed these priests? It's a very practical consideration. I didn't ask anyone, but that's what struck me. Right across the street, right down the block. So it is still, or even more, a consideration in the minds of bishops and those who have important persons, right? That if we were to build a chapel out there for this small group of families,
Yep.
how are they going to sustain this priest? And I need a priest over there. And there's 30,000 people in this area, and there's just 1,000, just 1,000. That's 1,000 souls, yeah, of course. But it's comparatively, someone may say it's just 1,000 out there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just putting out there, like, that's some of the things in consideration, especially as priests are getting older, dying, priests are leaving, and all sorts of, and also not enough coming up in the ranks. That being said, I never heard of what you mentioned, Nifty. I'm going to try to remember it.
Okay.
Nifty I or Nifty Y?
NIFTI.
Because I think it is ideal when you think about how parishes got started in the States. A Redemptorist priest, John Neumann, Bishop John Neumann, Saint John Neumann, he came here as a parish priest, sort of a missionary parish priest. So he was in Bavaria, and they said they need priests in America, so he came here to be a parish priest. But he felt like he was practically alone, and he needed a community. So he joined the Redemptorists, and they would send him to these different places where there were a group of German Catholics who had no priests.
That's right.
Catholics who had no priests, and he was very good at the language, so good that he went to an Irish parish, and a woman went to confession, and when she came out, she said, "Oh, thank God, we finally have an Irish priest." Point being that communities said to the bishop, "We need a priest. We're gathering," and it was mostly based off ethnicity. You know, the Italians have their priest. We need a German priest, so he would write to a German bishop. But if an intentional Catholic community was in a certain area, Montana, Wyoming, wherever you have, and they may not be many, but they're gathering regularly for prayer, and they're saying, "This is what we do. We're farmers. We get together every week. We say the rosary every day in the family, but we get together every week and pray the rosary at this place. Can you supply us a bishop, a priest?" That's a very long view, right? And you've got to have
It is.
a
It's
bishop
good.
who's sensitive and appreciative of that. But hearing this Nifty idea, you know, if there's a community already gathered and intentionally Catholic, that is a greater draw and not incentive, impulse for a bishop to say, "What? Okay, I'm not going to just lose him to a couple of families that want their own priest, but here's a community that's making efforts. They know their faith well, and that's something that I can put a resource into, which is a priest. First, beginning to send him more regularly, you know, once a month, once every 2 weeks, to say mass there, and then I say, you know, Bishop, we have this land, we can make a chapel. Can he be more permanently assigned? Can a priest be more permanently assigned?" But it's a very long view, and it depends on a lot of things you have no control over.
Right.
How many priests enter that diocese, that state. Of course, I'll leave it at that.
Okay,
Not an
well,
answer, but just things
correct.
to consider.
Thank you, Father.
But is the church doing that? I don't know of any bishops that are actively promoting that, because I think most of the focus is where there are a lot of people.
Sure. Have enough priests. Just trying to deal with that.
Right.
More pegs, more holes in pegs.
Uh-huh.
Trying to fill the pegs.
Personally, I think this needs to be a lay-led effort, and partly to answer your question. Maybe it's a case of the tail wagging the dog too. Sorry, Father. But you know, it just needs to be, you know, bigger and broader and grassroots, and you know, the priest will follow, I think. And I've also often thought too, you know, the history of the Catholic Church is kind of like a bell-shaped curve. You know, it started in Nazareth with the domestic church, with Christ and his mother and his father, and it peaked maybe in the Middle Ages. I think we're at the other end of the bell curve, so I think it's going to have to go back to the domestic church, if you will, with priests as well. And it's safer that way because, you know, the modernism infected all the great orders, all the great and beautiful orders, all of them. And I think we have to go smaller and, you know, more subsidiarity.
Benedict said in the late 60s, right?
What's that?
Benedict said that in 1969 or something.
Yeah.
The church was going to be
Yeah.
smaller
Yeah.
and
And Our Lady of La Salette, you know, said the church will be an eclipse, and I think we see that today, you know. So,
when you say, like, what do you think you're, like, what's your sense of, like, things getting really bad? Like, to me, it seems like I thought it was 2020, but, you know, 4 years later.
Sorry, I'm still COVID.
I mean, that was kind of the I think, opened the eyes.
Yeah, they overplayed their hand.
Myself included. Yeah, it's like, oh, that's just not going to happen. does seem like we're each day. It seems like it's progressing like quite a bit.
Well, it is. You know,
Fast.
for a long time I've said, you know, economically and morally we're toast. You know.
And there's got to be societal collapse at some point.
And empires come and empires go, and the American empire is in decline, and they're going to go kicking and screaming. If you're familiar with a book called The Fourth Turning,
Heard of it.
Talks, you should read that book. It gives you a big picture overview, but it's the 80 to 100 year cycle where, and this is prevalent throughout the world, you know, basically Western society, where it goes through 4 different stages. We're in the crisis period now. This is the fourth turning. It's always punctuated by war at the end. And each of the generations, I'm a baby boomer, so I'm called, our generation is called the prophets, because we grew up post World War II and we saw a different America. You know, things were intact, families were intact, the church was intact, etc. And then it slowly devolves. So you go from the high period post World War II to the Great Unraveling. No, the Great Awakening first, so it'd be the 70s and 80s, and then it goes into the Great Unraveling, and then and they kind of give time periods when these different stages will begin. They thought it would happen in 05, it happened in 08 with the mortgage crisis, you know, which was, you know, that was, you know, they were making so much money, you know, selling debt as an asset, if you can imagine. They figured all sorts of ways to make money. So that started in 08, and the projection is it'll be 2028 when we'll, you know, it'll finally collapse. So we're going to go through this terrible period, the Dark Ages, right? You know, and then come through another high period, but not before there's a lot of suffering. You know, so it's inevitable, and but there'll be a high period afterwards. So and what's interesting, the different generations bring different perspectives to it as well, which is really, and we all have to work and live together. So again, I think the Catholic Land Movement is the proper and appropriate response to all of this, because it's got all the answers, because we have the faith. So yeah, it's going to get dark. It has to.
There's another resource that I don't know if anybody's aware of, but another book has been published recently called The Liturgy of the Land.
Oh yes, excellent book.
Cultivating a Catholic Homestead.
Excellent book. Yes,
My wife, who's over at the other gardening thing right now, but she loves the book.
Excellent book.
It
Yes.
only came out, I guess, within the last couple months.
April. Yeah. In fact, I don't know if Jason is here or not. Yeah, the church, the Liturgy of the Land, the Liturgy and the Land. Correct. I meant to buy a case of those as well. Excellent. If he was here, I didn't want to overstep him. It is. It's too young. Well, tell the story. You know the book.
Well, I haven't actually read it. I know my wife has. But
Okay.
I wasn't sure what it was going to be like when I bought it for her birthday.
Excellent.
But when she started reading it only 2 weeks ago, it basically goes through a very holistic approach, talking about the history and everything like that. There's a lot of Catholic teaching involved in it. So I thought maybe it might have been just more like a hands-on kind of how to make a homestead, but it was actually more of the base stuff like you're talking about.
Correct.
Roots.
Correct. Yes. It's two young contemporaries of ours, homesteaders in different states. And can you hand this to Father for me, please? I meant to give that earlier. Thank you. Their own experiences with their homestead, you know, the good and the bad, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Practical stuff, real life stuff, believable, and it's almost like a kitchen table discussion with them. And then at the end chapter, they talk about the different skill sets they've learned, and they gave it a hierarchy in terms of which is easier, which is more difficult. Horses are at the bottom of the list, and they're a lot of fun, but they're really not that productive. They eat a lot of food and need a lot of care, unless they're draft horses. You put them to work, you know, pull a plow, pull a wagon. But I think it's nicely done. And, you know, all the other books theory's good, but, you know, this book kind of applies the theory. It's
I think that's more the
well written.
More of the it's reachable by a lot more people, I think.
Yep, I think so too.
And it's-
I meant to buy a case and bring.
beautiful in it
Yeah, it's
and
gorgeous.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know, the other ones are great just from a philosophical standpoint.
Correct.
But,
Right.
But I think from maybe as like a first approach.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great idea.
Guide to homestead.
Next time, there's another conference coming up, by the way, in middle of September in Indiana. Another Catholic Land Movement conference coming, excellent as well. I will have a case of those books with me as well. Yes.
Is the Catholic land movement, are they out in like Idaho, Wyoming? Do you know if they're out west at all?
Mike would know better about that. What I'm encouraging Mike to do is to change the database system. You know, everybody signs in, you get assigned to somebody, but I want everybody that's in that database to be able to network with each other. Maybe have a state rep, you know, kind of help coordinate things. But I'm sure it's happening out west as well. Do you have family out there or friends out there?
We're looking at moving out there.
Do you? Okay, okay. Yes. So we've got to change the database. I don't know how many names are in there, but I think the wealth of this movement is everybody that's in it, you know, so we need to start to talk to each other. So I'm working with a couple of developers to make it secure, figure out all the parameters of it. You know, sheep herders can find each other. Everybody from Oregon can find each other. Things like that. You know, the strength is the network, and it's not set up that way yet. But that wasn't the intent initially. You know. So,
there's a key element that's.
Hey, you're an IT. Maybe you can help. Yeah, really.
See, so there's a key element that's really, really important in all this that I haven't heard mentioned here yet, but I promise you it's going on.
Okay.
And at the same time, maybe it needs more attention, which is the kind of the discernment side of things. In our little project,
Mm-hmm.
it's just been God doing it. I mean, just straight up, God doing it. To one of the things we talked about. So I'm a deacon, and we have a little project going on up in Maine, and they're from Massachusetts, I'm from New Hampshire, etc. But to the point where one of the base farmers who's kind of grounded a community in that area, the rural area of Maine, western Maine, and that family has kind of grounded this thing, but they've attracted people. They've attracted some priests and some nuns and various things. And one of the nuns that was attracted at one point when they had a bed and breakfast kind of thing where she could stay, she was writing a book. She's like, I have to have the Eucharist. We need to go down to the diocese. And they went down to the diocese. This is a while ago. It's a couple of bishops ago now. But they went down to the diocese and said, and she said, I need to have the Eucharist, you know, blah, 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 blah. And they said, no, you don't fit the criteria. But they looked at the farmer. And he had no idea that any of this. And they looked at the farmer and they said, but you can.
Is that right?
We know about your chapel. We know you have a community. We know it's been stable for 10 years. You can have the Eucharist if you want it. Here's the form. The Eucharist is reposed on the land contiguous to our land. But God did it.
What?
Yeah, that's why we're there. I mean, straight up, the Eucharist is a walk, a short walk.
Right,
A
right.
It's a beautiful chapel. He built it, the farmer built it.
And spent like no money on it.
So, Frank, going back to your initial point, it's what you're not hearing
It's
yet.
the discernment piece of it. So like
Discernment, okay.
Where is God's voice?
Okay.
Because
Okay.
it's easy to overthink the
Mhm,
side of this and underthink the what does God have to say about this. And
Okay.
I'm a spiritual director and that kind of stuff. That's what I do. So trying to listen to the Lord and say, okay, you know, to the point of our land.
It's only been 2 years.
2 years ago, the farmer is out, and we've been looking for 2 years during COVID when the prices went through the roof in that area because of this community we found. And the farmer's out in May maybe, fixing his fence line on his northern thing, and he calls us, and we've looked at dozens of properties, too many rocks, this, that, you know. He knew how to read the land. And he says, friend, I found your land. And I'm like, what do you mean? He says, I'm out fixing my northern fence line, and I just ran back to call you because this is your land right here. And I said, okay. And we talked, and so it was a piece of land that was owned by a forestry family that hadn't been farmed in 100 years-ish. It was a farm, and now it was all trees, and it was getting harvested on a regular basis. We called the lady up. She said, yeah, we'll sell it for half-ish what it would have been worth in the COVID times. And 2 years later, we have some buildings and tractors and stuff. So, but God did it. Like I didn't do anything. They didn't
All
do
these
it.
people just started coming.
That's amazing.
It's hard
God
to-
did it.
That's amazing.
I mean, I don't even go up there that much, a couple of times. It's a lot, but
So I think what you're saying, Fran, is that prayer needs to be at the epicenter of this effort. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
prayer and understanding about how God speaks to you and to your community. 'Cause it's not, you know, it's not always obvious. It's not always obvious.
Going back, well, that raises a good point, actually. There was a priest named Father Luigi Laguchi. Came here. Do you know of him?
I do.
Okay.
I don't know his story, but I
Oh,
know
okay. He came here with his family. Oh gosh, I don't remember now. Early 1920s or 30s. He came from family land that had been in his family for 1,000 years. That's, you know, so he had a deep roots in the land. He was drawn to the Mass, the beautiful Latin Mass, and became a priest. And then he was assigned. I think he was a secular priest. I'm not sure, but he was signed out to Oregon, and I don't recall the name of the town, but he had a parish called Assumption, and he started a program there to teach young men how to be farmers and the women to be farmers' wives. That's interesting. It's a collaborative, you know. Again, the essence of any economic model should be the family. It starts with the family. It was a very successful program. So when Roosevelt came along and started giving away land, homesteading land, he got in line for the land as one of the first, because they already had an up and running program. So he was able to get land from the federal government. He started a series of homesteads. I think he had 400 homesteads at the peak of it. And the idea was to put families back into a small community. They had very simple homes. They had some land. They were in community, but the roads were kind of serpentine. I think it'd be better to do it more of a rectangle like a city. And took off. And it saved a lot of families. The men would work in the coal mines in the winter months, and it was debauchery, drinking, gambling, fighting, murder. So he said, we got to stop this. So he took families. He was part of the review committee, you know, who was going to be put in these properties, and it took off like crazy. And like after the second year with these homesteads, they had their first big harvest festival with a mass and food. So that was a good model, but then World War II basically wiped it up. But the reason I bring him up is he has a little prayer book. I have one copy of it. Father Hector Boldock, who has since died, very interested in this movement. He reprinted the book. I have to find that book. In fact, I contacted to see if I could get it. I'm sure there are cases of them around, but it's a little prayer book. He was president for a while, something called the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, which is still around, but it's kind of defunct now. I think it got woke. But there was an effort to help Catholics, as you were saying, Father, you know, help them with their religious needs in the rural communities, because the focus was now the bigger cities. It was easier. It's more work to go out into the field. So that's an excellent prayer book. Beautiful prayers, blessings. You know, I should have brought that. I'd like to track it down, and you know, because I'm sure there are books. Yes, Father.
May I mention, since you mentioned it, it's not a Catholic website, archive.org.
Okay.
I enjoy it a lot. I use it dozens of times in the week, because any old Catholic book that I'm looking for,
I've heard of that.
not
Yeah.
everyone, but very many times it's been scanned and put on that website. And if it's not, I recommend that you do.
Okay.
Because at some point someone comes along and say, you know what, I'll take the PDFs, I'll bind it, and
Exactly.
make it more available.
Yeah. Yeah. This book's available. He died. I don't know where they are. Hey, I'm sure he printed cases of these books. He was too bad we lost him too. But he was deeply interested, and myself and another friend in Michigan, we're very happy to work with Father, and then he died very suddenly, which is very sad. But we'll have others pick up the gauntlet. Yes.
I also wanted to mention, this might make people nervous, and it's an odd thing to say as a priest, but a part of St. Alphonsus' mission, when they would go out to the missions, say they went out, and sometimes it wasn't a parish, it was just these workers, these farmers in this mountain village. He would preach the faith to them, devotion to Our Lady. It's very big on devotions. Chaplets, which is essentially, if they didn't have a priest, maintaining your faith despite not having a priest.
Right.
Not becoming
Right.
a Protestant, not
Right.
saying we don't need him.
Right.
But you may not have one soon. Maybe the next mission is in 3 years, and they go for feast days, they really trek into a bigger village. But while they're out and they don't have a priest, how do you maintain your faith as a community? Keeping Sundays holy, though not having a mass. It is possible. It's not comfortable, but it's going to be more and more necessary. So if one
It is.
prepares for that, and if God wills that a chapel is built, that the Eucharist is reserved, that a priest can come, blessed be God. But what do we do if that is not possible? One has to be maintain the faith with that in his family, in his community, just like the Japanese who had no priest for 200 years.
That's right. And they preserve the faith, right? That's right. Good point. That book I mentioned earlier called Restoring the Family, the practice in pre-French Revolutionary France was also the hierarchical structure of the family. The husband is the head of the family. His wife is second in command. They work as a unit, and the children are obedient and submissive to their parents. That is also the structure for society. So simple, so beautiful. And what the wife brings to the family, he cites several several quotes. One from Father John Vianney. It says, "I'm a priest because of my mother." Saint Thomas Aquinas says, "I owe everything to my mother." You know, there's a famous poem by a Scottish author that says, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." You know, so there's no substitute for the importance of the woman in the family and her care and her love of her children. I'm always, as I recall by my mother, I one time called her my dear sainted Irish mother. Says, "I'm not dead yet." Sorry, I didn't mean that, Mom. But you know, yeah.
You're not allowed to say that in any way superior. You're supposed to be all equal, right?
My mom always says, "Your guardian angel is very happy when you go to bed." She had 9 kids. I'm the eldest. So, but the point is all of us, and we can reflect back on our mothers and just the subtle, lifelong influence of her love and care for us. Yeah, so it's amazing. Yes?
You mentioned about the history of, well, obviously the Catholic land movement, but also secular land movement. What about Protestant, evangelical, different types of Christianity denomination, the history of the land movement from the perspective of other Christian denominations, and, you know, how can the Catholic land movement sort of learn from that, or
Well, they've done some good things. As I mentioned, you know, the small-scale agricultural movement is largely woke, you know, very progressives. But you know, there's some. You know, we can learn a lot of lessons from them in terms of, you know, farming skills, and like, you know, I mentioned, you know, Incubator Farms. There's a lot we can borrow from them. But I think in the essence of what we're trying to do is make this, our Catholic faith at the epicenter of it, and everything radiates from there. So I mean, we lead by example, I think.
so that's the secular. But what about other forms of Christianity?
Well, again, I think we need to be exclusive, to be candid with you. You know.
I understand that, but what have you seen any of the history of their movement?
In terms of the Catholic land movement or the other movements?
The Protestant back to the land movements. Is there a parallel thing?
Not that I know of. No, you know, because they all differ on everything. You know, so that I don't think that's ever going to happen. That's a good question. Good point. You know, but we have the faith. We have the unity of the faith. So I think we have an upper hand in that respect. But I think in general, again, going back to the group, you know, Mid-Atlantic, CASA is and many of them are non-believers as well. You know, I didn't get a sense of a lot of Protestant ethnicity within there. Not at all. I didn't hear it anyways. You know.
You do find in certain areas. So in our area, we do have there's a Catholic community, and then there's a broader Christian community, and then there's just a farming community.
Yeah, that's right.
And it goes out like that. It's kind of like the family, and the elements that are drawing Catholic families to that area are drawing Protestant families as well. And then it's a question of how to interact with them and keep the faith and keep the true faith within an area. And one of the elements up there is Amish. So our farmer friends are interacting with the Amish communities quite extensively on primitive farming techniques, things like that.
Right. Yeah, lots of lessons to learn from them, without a doubt. Yeah, they've done a very good job on that. But you know, I mean, let's put it this way. You know, it's an opportunity for conversion too. You know.
Exactly. Yeah. Have
That's-
you heard of Korak at all? C-O-R. Yeah. It's Catholic.
C-O-R.
C-O-R-A-C. So it stands
Core.
for the Core of Renewal and Charity.
Oh, really?
And it's a guy, Charlie Johnston, started it, Catholic. And right now he has the United States. It's internet divided up into regions. And they have health and wellness, faith, health and wellness classes,
Correct.
safety training,
Mhm.
sustainability, gardening. They have a whole website. So it's just, I'm just wondering, because it's kind of a little parallel, but it's about local district. You know, it's the same type of kind of philosophy behind it, of bringing it down to the local levels and learning how to garden and learning how to grow food and learning how to have something for, you know, a bee sting or natural remedies
Interesting.
or homeschooling.
Interesting. I'll have to look up.
Yeah.
Look, they should be here and giving a talk or two.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
you know, you just wonder
For the
if we're
future.
all doing like pieces of these
Correct.
different things, and it's like, how do you get this connection?
Interesting. Well, good. All right, great.
Charlie Johnston.
Yes.
Do they have a website? C-O-R-A-C?
It's
No, it's something else, isn't it?
No, it's correct.co.
Got C-O. Okay. Might well look them up. Good idea. Thank you. Thank you.
Is the website.
One more time.
He's
C-O-R-A-C.
dot.
C-O.
10-minute warning. No, 5-minute warning.
5. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, good. This is a good discussion, I hope. And glad you're here. This is a movement. It's underway. We're still fumbling a bit, but we'll get our footing, you know, in time, God willing. I'll be over at the table for some books and questions. I have some other handouts too, by the way. They got water damage, but they're still readable. But good. Well, thank you all for coming today. Okay. You're welcome. My pleasure. My pleasure.